I'm Leo Walder for Kit Guru. This motherboard is the ASUS ROG Crosshair 7 Hero Wi-Fi, which is an X470 motherboard that supports the latest Ryzen 2nd gen processors. Also, by definition, the first gen Ryzens as well. As we know, X370, X470 pin compatible sockets and have a huge amount in common. This board was actually sent to me by AMD. If you've watched or read any reviews of the Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7 2nd gens when they launched, you will doubtless have come across this motherboard on a few occasions because AMD sent out 2 motherboards to every reviewer, and it seems like a huge proportion of those reviewers got in one of their 2 boards the ASUS. Funnily enough, I've noticed in some of the pictures and other reviewers, like them, I've got this kind of battered box going on. I don't understand it. It arrived like this, like it's weather worn. Very strange. So I received in my press kit the ASUS and also an MSI board I've not yet reviewed. But the fact was I actually did my reviews on the Gigabyte Aorus Gaming 7 board purely because that arrived first directly from Gigabyte and it just worked out the box. And I had 2 thoughts. One is it's arrived, it works, why mess? I'm doing a CPU review and I want stability primarily. The other one was I kind of wrote in my mind's eye the ASUS ROG Crosshair 7 Hero review kind of in advance, which is it's built like a tank, it's fully featured, it's quite expensive, performs brilliantly, great for overclockers, the usual ROG stuff. But I noticed that in some of those reviews to do with the launch of 2nd gen Ryzen, that actually this motherboard didn't come out of it too well. So I thought, okay, there are bound to be BIOS updates. ASUS always updates the BIOS at a furious rate with new boards, particularly the high-end products. I'll sit tight. I've got other things to get on with. I've already reviewed the Gigabyte board and also an ASRock X470 Tai Chi. I'll come back to the Hero, and here we are with it. And there have indeed been quite a few BIOS updates, which has actually been significant. So let's start by taking a tour of the board. It is expensive at £227 in the UK, including VAT, but at the moment all X470 boards appear to be expensive because apart from else, the 400 series chipsets are X rather than lower, you know, Bs and such like. And they seem to be aimed at the enthusiasts, the early adopters, which makes sense. I mean, this is across the piece. This is the 4 motherboard manufacturers in the UK. So ASRock, ASUS, MSI, Gigabyte. This Crosshair 7 is fully featured without a shadow of a doubt. But before we let's just do the accessories because that won't take very long at all. So we've got software, a download thing, cable mod, okay. Manual, stickers, get those out of the way. We've got their Wi-Fi antennae, hence the Wi-Fi name, or as with the Wi-Fi name. That's an RGB extension for digital RGB. That is a regular RGB cable. There are some SATA cables, there's an SLI bridge, and that's one of those front panel doohickeys so you can connect your case to that and then connect it in one fell swoop to your front panel headers, and a couple of M.2 screws. I would say that for any premium motherboard, that's the absolute rock bottom minimum you're going to get. For a ROG, that's actually quite low end. Many ROG boards are considerably more than £227, and they can be £300, £400, £500, £600. So even though this is a ROG board, it's not a colossal. In fact, it's pretty much the cheapest ROG board you're going to find realistically. Going around, we've got, apart from the look and the feel, we've got the fixed I/O panel, so the shield and the shroud is there, so you don't get a separate piece of tin to go in your case. That is fixed. We've got the VRMs, which are covered by a very solid pair of heat sinks, which are linked by a heat pipe. I'll be covering that in a little bit more detail shortly. We've got the AM4 socket with the usual plastic hold downs. We have 4 DDR4 slots, and then taking a tour around the headers and connectors, we've got a 4-pin and an 8-pin power connector at the top of the board. For Ryzen, you don't really need the second connector, but it's taking up minimum of space. There's no particular harm. 3 fan headers at the top, CPU opt, and also an AIO pump. That's interesting. I tried actually connecting my Fractal Design Celsius S24 to that, and whilst it worked, it returned an error in that the Fractal cooler, the fans are connected to the body, so you only have the one connection. You don't connect the pump to one place and the fans to a separate header, and therefore there was no fan reading. If you connect to CPU or CPU opt, you're going to have less trouble because the board can recognize it has fans working. Without fans, it gets upset. We have a postcode debug readout. We've got two RGB headers, one digital, one conventional. We've got a start button and a reset button in the usual style. There we have the memory VRMs, 24-pin header, USB 3.1 Gen 2, so that's going to be for your Type-C on your front panel. Continuing down the side, we have a 4-pin chassis fan header, 6 laid down SATA, another chassis fan header, a header that's marked external fan, which I don't quite understand, front panel headers, chassis fan, 2 more RGB connectors, so these are kind of the twins of these up the top. USB 3.1 Gen 1, that's ROG extension, which is for one of those external ROG units that I haven't seen for a few years actually. There we have USB 2. Here we have your 3 ROG switches and buttons that you get for extreme overclockers, which are slow mode, retry and safe mode. So basically you can try settings, and if the board gets deeply unhappy, you've got a decent chance of recovering your settings without having to completely clear the BIOS and start over. And here we have audio, and there we have the audio caps. On the I/O panel we have a full set of surround sound audio jacks along with SP diff. We've got Ethernet, a couple of USB 3.1 Gen 2s, one Type A, one Type C, 8 USB 3.0s, a traditional PS2 for an old school mouse or keyboard, 2 USB 2s, one of which is the designated port for updating your BIOS, Wi-Fi antenna points, and then buttons for clear CMOS and also for BIOS flashback. If I was to cover the socket, you probably couldn't tell me that this was an AM4 board rather than the Z370 or whatever, because in a sense it's generic ROG. That's not a bad thing in the slightest. After all, ASUS has massive experience with ROG. It's just, there's nothing leaping out at me which says this is specific to AMD. On the other hand, I'm looking at some of these things like slow start, and unless you're intending to do 5 gigahertz on liquid nitrogen or whatever, no, you don't really need that. Now, I don't think it costs ASUS a great deal of money to put these features in place. In a sense, they take them off the shelf and they know what they're doing. But the odds that you're going to use most of those features, I would say, particularly with Ryzen 2nd Gen, is very, very low, because essentially the processor comes out of the box working correctly. It doesn't overclock hardly worth a damn. You clearly can't delid it. Many of those features, as far as I'm concerned, are almost window dressing. They look great, they look lovely, but I don't think you're going to use a good many of them. It's a little bit like the water flow connection, which appears to be a bits power specific connection. We've seen that now on a couple of ROG boards. The idea is that it can detect if your cooling system is leaking. It doesn't spell out how that happens, and that's not a feature that's supported by, as far as I'm aware, either AlphaCool or EKWB. So it's not like a universal feature. It's a feature that's actually very specific. So at first glance, it's an impressive motherboard, but the idea you're going to use all these features, I would say not a chance. With the I/O shield removed and the heatsink pulled off, you can see that the ROG board is built like a tank. I must confess I had my concerns when I saw the VRM heatsink because it's so solid. There's a lot of bulk to it, it weighs quite a lot, but in terms of surface area, not so great. Spoiler alert, during my testing the VRMs were just as cool can be. I don't think it's so much to do with the cooler itself, however. I think it's the construction of the board. I think it's just inherently cool. And then we have the 12 VRMs. Now, typically you'd think there'd be a range maybe 10 and 2, possibly 8 and 4, 2 or 4 for the SoC, these over here being for the memory. Actually not so. Not that it makes a blind bit of difference, but the controller back there is actually linked with these VRMs here for the SoC. So it's an unusual configuration. Essentially it's 525, but it's 10 and 2, however you want to look at it, and it works very well. The hardware is familiar, so we've got International Rectifier 3555s, which we've seen all over the place. I mean, really, cover the socket, you tell me, is that X299, is it X370, is it Z370? It could be almost anything. It could even be LGA 2011 from the past. It's instantly familiar and yet different, but the quality of the hardware is undeniable. Also, it's when I was doing my tour of the board earlier, I clean forgot to mention the fact you've got two M.2s. The one lives under that cover there, which is aluminium. Whoops, drops the screw. Aluminium, so it acts as a bit of a heat sink, and the other is bare down the bottom. So to sum up, there's a lot of good stuff to like there. Our test system is an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X CPU, both at stock clocks and also at 4.25 GHz on all cores. We've got some G-Skill Sniper X DDR4 3400 MHz memory, that's in dual channel mode. We've got an EVGA GTX 1080 Ti SC graphics card. The SSD is an SK Hynix SC311 STD. Cooler is this fractal design Celsius S24, so it's a 240mm Ace-Tech, and the power supply, Seasonic Prime Titanium 1000 watt. This is the setup screen of the BIOS 0509. I'm not going to show you the details of the BIOS, you don't need to see them because we're not stopping here for long. I'm just going to show you what the motherboard does with this BIOS installed. During this run of Cinebench, we know the Ryzen 7 2700X will be loaded on all cores. We're going to keep an eye on CPU V-core, which here is kind of around a nominal 1.4 volts. There we go. And it will sort of dip down to a nominal 1.35. At the moment, obviously under zero load. And at the moment, we've got the clock speed showing down here. Click CPU run. And the voltage droops to 1.25 approximately. It's going to fluctuate slightly, but call it 1.25. Clock speed here, 4.015 gigahertz. Will it dip below 4? Actually, that's quite stable. 1.24 volts. And we're finished. The result, you will note, is just under 1800 marks. What I've demonstrated there, and this is a different Cinebench run on the screen, so I've run it a few times, is that on BIOS 0509, the voltage droops quite significantly to 1.25 volts when you'd expect it to stick around the 1.3, and the performance is nothing special. It's not bad, it's just that little bit less than all the competing X470 motherboards. It seems clear to me ASUS was not prepared to accept this, and that's the reason why they sent me a completely different BIOS to use for my review testing. And that BIOS version is 8601. After some judicious fast forward, because the update process actually takes quite a few minutes, here we are in BIOS 8601, which is an ASUS performance BIOS. You can tell that by the 8 prefix. This is not actually the first performance BIOS I sent by ASUS, but this is the one I used for my testing. So we've got a stack of options in here. So if you go into, for example, memory timings, you can just change every single aspect of the memory. Within main, you've got just system information and the usual styling. Extreme Tweaker is a ROG classic. You've got a whole bunch of profiles that each of which actually merits some attention. And these also tend to change from BIOS version to BIOS version. So whether you actually have these precise profiles in your BIOS, that's a different matter. But yep, those are fun and games, worth trying. But we're not going to do any of this. We're going to stick with stock clocks for the time being. So we go down, so overclock tuner, default manual DOCP standard, as you'd expect. Note all this is on auto. Okay, Tweaker's Paradise, again an ASUS ROG classic. The external Digi control power setup, that is, I mean, just look at the options. Absolute, everything you could conceivably want in a BIOS is there. And again, you'll note, so DRAM voltage 1.2 auto. Move that mouse. You'll note there the CPU core voltage on auto is currently around 1.37 volts. But then previously on auto, the BIOS voltage, there we are, 1.44. So the auto voltage at the moment, under zero load, there's no change. Go across to advanced, you've got a whole bunch of settings. All very ROG-y, and definitely a cut above the other AMD X470 boards we've seen so far, but exactly what you'd expect to see from a high-end ASUS ROG board. So let's just change the DRAM voltage to 1.35 and change the memory frequency to DDR4 3400. There we go. So everything auto apart from bumping up the memory to its true, there we go, true setting. As before, we're going to run Cinebench and we're going to keep an eye on voltage and clock speed. Clock speed is now 4.1 something gigahertz, 4.14 there. Voltage 1.35, 1.36. In previous runs, it was actually sitting at a rock solid 1.40, but that's actually quite solid at 1.36. 4.115 gigahertz, 4.14. And there we have it, and the score 1834. Updating the BIOS to version 8601 appears to affect load line calibration. Certainly the core voltage is maintained under load. You could see before it's running around 1.4, even higher than that, 1.45 volts, and then under load it was drooping to 1.25, which is lower than we'd expect. 1.3 is about what you'd expect it to be. So typically 1.30 is your stop voltage, 1.40 is an overclock voltage, and then stock voltage, the CPU handles its own speed, slightly over 4 gigahertz, manual overclocking 4.2 gigahertz. The range is really tight. But the effect of putting the performance bias on this motherboard, it's very strange. Because what it means is, basically, out of the box, the processor is fully overclocked. Although the speed is slightly lower than the manual potential of 4.2 gigahertz, running at 4.1 the bit, and this environment is cooler than my regular testing environment, so I'm actually getting it running slightly faster here than I am in the usual place. But putting that to one side, the processor out of the box runs really well on that BIOS. If you manually force the voltage down to 1.3, you get performance that's more akin to what the other motherboards will do at stock voltage, which is what you'd expect. 1.3 is the auto setting other motherboards use. This auto setting is not the same as the others. But it's not entirely stable. You have to kind of play around with other settings. So clearly there's more going on than just core voltage. And I've seen this before with a few motherboards over the years. Sometimes you change the obvious apparent setting and it doesn't behave the same. If you leave this on stock voltages, auto settings with the performance bias, it performs like a dream. But here's the point, it behaves like an overclocked system because it is overclocked. You're giving it 1.4 volts, and that means maybe drooping to 1.35, but I saw 1.4 consistently. And that means that Precision Boost 2 allows it to overclock as though it's been manually overclocked on all cores. So really it's heading towards 4.2 gigahertz, but not quite getting there. And as a consequence, power draw and heat are the same as a manually overclocked ASRock or Gigabyte or whatever. We've seen similar behavior before with sort of like behind the scenes overclocking with Intel motherboards from ASUS, and in this instance it seems to be doing something similar with the AMD. Now my feeling is that, well, this might be shady behavior by ASUS, but I'm not calling it that. I think really what it is as simple as when ASUS launched this motherboard with the, and any number of reviewers saw it, the AMD press kit for Ryzen's 2nd gen, it didn't perform that well. A BIOS update that basically gives it more power and allows Precision Boost to stretch its legs makes the motherboard look quite good in terms of speed and performance, but it hurts it in terms of power and heat. You cannot really run this motherboard at stock in the sense of what every other motherboard does, settings. It doesn't want to do it. You can't just drop the core voltage to 1.3 and have the board behave normally. You have to work at those lower settings, and why would you bother? But the funny thing is this, my CPU, my Ryzen 7 2700X, doesn't have the ability to run, as far as I'm aware, beyond 4.2 gigahertz. 4.3 is the sort of thing it'll do in certain benchmarks, certain software, but it's not good to run beyond 4.25 gigahertz in every piece of software you come across. So that's the limit of the processor. The irony is that what this means is this motherboard delivers performance at auto settings which basically are the Macs. If you go into that extensive BIOS and start changing the various other settings and you've got all the options under the sun, there's really nothing to be gained. You can simply run this motherboard out of the box on auto using the performance BIOS, and it is an overclocked system. And that's quite extraordinary, but to me, the heat and the power are uncomfortably high. Having said that, the VRM temperatures are very low. I have no doubt this motherboard can do this all day long, forever. In that sense, the hardware is absolutely superb. So it's a really curious thing. I'm glad ASUS sent me the performance BIOS, because if I'd just done it at stock settings, actually this motherboard would have been slightly disappointing, and I would have said, well, it's overpriced, it doesn't deliver, avoid it. As it is, I'm going to say it's very strange that they've given you an extensive BIOS you just do not need. By all means investigate it, but don't bother. There is no point. Auto does the trick. It's far too juicy for stock settings, but it's not stock settings. With Precision Boost 2, auto means it's overclocked. Very strange, never seen anything quite like it before. And I'm not entirely sure I like it, because auto and stock, you expect certain things, and you cannot compare the auto stock settings of this BIOS to other motherboards because it's not doing the same thing. We need some sort of new terminology, which is out of the box 1.4V or some such, because that's what this is doing. Pulling back, the ASUS ROG Crosshair 7 Hero Wi-Fi, to give it its full, rather wordy name, is an impressive piece of hardware, and in a sense it outperforms the processor. ASUS clearly let the side down with the original BIOSes. They've basically chucked some electric at it to make the processor perform the way they want it, and now I imagine they're happy. It appears to be a slightly crude approach. Certainly the performance is there. Balanced against that, you've got power, you've got heat, which are higher than you might like to see. And really what this boils down to is that the Ryzen 7 2700X, it has so little headroom for overclocking. Now, if there's another Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9 or whatever coming along in the near future, and I hope it's more than just a 2800X, if there's some extra supermodel that's going to really let this motherboard stretch its legs, well, great, absolutely lovely. As things stand, this motherboard offers a whole stack of features that you simply don't need, but it's built like a tank, it looks great, and it really does pack in a bunch of features. As to whether it's good value for money, not so sure. It's the wrong side of £200, which is what you'd expect for a ASUS ROG. And it doesn't really make sense to spend that much money on a motherboard married to that processor. That's the way I see it anyway, plus some decent quality memory. So as things stand, I'm much happier that I've reviewed this motherboard at this point with this BIOS than if I'd done it at the launch of the 2nd gen Ryzen, because I'd have been bitterly disappointed. I'm absolutely certain of that. As things stand, this is a better combo than that would have been. Nonetheless, it's a very curious thing. You need to look closely at our test figures and not just look at the graphs for performance. You also need to check out voltages, temperatures, power draw, and really compare closely with the other motherboards and processors and the settings at which you'll be using your motherboard. On paper, this delivers decent performance to this BIOS, but there is a cost, both financial and in terms of power. If you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't, thumbs down. If you want more from Kit Guru, click to subscribe. Hit the bell button, you'll be alerted to new videos from Kit Guru as they come along. I'm Leo Warder for Kit Guru. This is the ASUS ROG Crosshair 7 Hero Wi-Fi.